Hi, I'm Gary Sanders. Welcome to Live and Local. Tonight's show, we're going to be talking about the No Child Left Behind Act, and specifically how it affects the Iowa City Public Schools. With me tonight is Pam Ehly, Director of Instruction at the Iowa City Schools, Barb Henke, math teacher and president of the Iowa City Education Association. By the way, Barb, our Secretary of Education, Rod Page, has deemed that a terrorist group.
Yes.
So I hope we're not going to have any trouble here tonight.
No. We're very upset about Rod Page.
Okay. And on my far right is Sue Dvorsky, a special ed teacher at Southeast Junior High School. The No Child Left Behind Act has been in the news quite a bit lately. On the national scene, we have our Democratic presidential candidates denouncing it, even though they voted for it. And we have headlines in the Iowa City Press-Citizen that Northwest Junior High School and Southeast Junior High School are on some sort of watch list, that they're failing schools, and that next year City High and West High are also going to be on this watch list. I'd like to know what is going on here. Let's start with Pam.
Good question, Gary. The No Child Left Behind Act is really just a catchy name for legislation that was passed during the Lyndon Johnson administration, known as Elementary Education, Secondary Education Act, or ESEA. Now, about once every 7 years, this is reauthorized in Congress, and by reauthorization, I mean that the funding is reviewed, usually increased, and the rules and regulations are reviewed and oftentimes changed. Well, in fact, as it was reviewed in 2001, the changes that were implemented and signed into legislation in January of 2002 were fairly dramatic. I think what was the most dramatic is we have now seen a major shift in what had been state control in public school education, and it has shifted a great deal of that to regulations from the federal level. The biggest changes that we see have to do with a required testing of students for academic achievement in reading and in mathematics, some changes relative to teacher qualifications and what's required, attendance rates that are mandatory, graduation rates, factors like all students speak English, but probably the most important one has to do with this whole area of testing and having to reach a certain test score in order to be labeled as what is known as proficient. And what's most significant is that it's for all students, not a percentage of students, but every single student that goes to the public school, independent of what their ability or background would be.
Okay, well, Barb, I have to say, required testing, that sounds reasonable.
Well, and we think it is. Required testing is not unreasonable. I think the entire law has really good it's really good for us to look at how kids are doing. There's nothing wrong with doing that. I think what we're concerned about is that the testing becomes the only thing we look at. The testing becomes so that there's such rigor in what their expectations are that it's unreasonable. Mm-hmm. Unreasonable expectations for the kind of percentages of students. I think that's the thing we're mostly concerned about.
Well, Sue, you are a teacher at Southeast, and you are on the watch list. How did this happen? I truly don't understand this.
Well, we are on the watch list, as is the other junior high, as the other secondaries will be soon. One of the things that I'm interested in this discussion for is that I am a teacher at Southeast. I'm a special education teacher at Southeast. I have been a special education teacher for almost the entire length of time that the public law has actually supported students with significant challenges in the public schools. And one of the major concerns I've got, and this has been in the facts and the stories and the regulations have been in the paper, but in the last couple of weeks, the Press-Citizen has carried an editorial and some letters to the editor from parents of kids with significant learning challenges. And one of the things that really concerns me is backlash against kids who are working so hard, teachers working hard to teach them, kids who are becoming more proficient, kids who are making progress, and who will never be able to have their progress and their proficiency counted with their classmates. And in fact, because they can't make those artificially set standards are bringing the whole school into the label of being in need of assistance. I don't think that that was the intent. I certainly don't think that that was the intent of the majority of the bipartisan support that that reauthorization got. I can't imagine that it was. We have kids who are learning. And as Barb said, there is no question. I would be the last person in the world, as a person who teaches kids with significant challenges, I'd be the last person in the world to say I shouldn't be held accountable. Of course I should be, for their progress. Mm-hmm. But I can't be held accountable to bring them to a level of proficiency that's really above what they will be capable of doing. It won't matter what my teaching is.
So is this why Southeast and Northwest are on the watch list and potentially or probably City High and West High?
It is the subgroups, and Pam will be better able to speak to this, but it is subgroups that do it.
Okay, subgroups. What is a subgroup?
In the reporting of the test data, a school district has to tell how all of the children did as a total group, and then they break it out by the subgroups of ethnicity, by the subgroup of special education, children on free and reduced lunch, and children who have English as their second language. So you'll look at a subgroup of the total population, and that whole group is held to the same standard as the total group. So let's just say, for example, if there were 500 students at Southeast Junior High, this year at least 65% or 63% of them had to be at this certain level in reading. And let's say that in that there happened to be 30 students that were in special education. Well, 65% of those 30 students also had to be at that high level. And if you just think about it, that doesn't make sense. If the children were struggling enough that they needed a special program, then they probably would have been proficient and then wouldn't have needed the program.
Well,
so the rules are curious at best.
Well, I know this is a 1,000-page law.
Right.
But it just strikes me as odd. Didn't anybody, and I don't know the answer to this, didn't any teachers read this, teachers' lobbying groups, either the American Federation of Teachers or the National Education Association? Was there any lobbying, to your knowledge, before all this was put in?
I don't know the specific answer to whether or not that was actually read. But I believe what really happened in Congress was there were some negotiations that went on. There was a pretty strong push to have vouchers for private school education by one of the two parties. That didn't get played out as the legislation was finally signed. But I think there was some negotiations back and forth that, well, we'll give you more money in education if we can have these other criteria. And on the surface, they sound really great. Hold people accountable, give kids tests to see how they're doing, publish the results, and because our administration right now is kind of pro-sanctions, there were all these sanctions that were let out, which I think the general public needs to understand that ultimately, if the law isn't changed, the vast majority of the school districts in the United States of America will have to be taken over by the United States Department of Education. Now, even if you wanted that to happen, I don't think practically it can. I don't believe there's that much private industry in education to take over every school district in the United States of America.
Mm-hmm. By the way, if there's any parents out there who would like to call in and ask any of our guests any specific questions, we'll try to do that. Technology willing and my abilities willing to handle the phone. Well, I know that several states have said to the federal government that we're not going to do it. For example, Utah, which is a Republican legislature, and Virginia have actually voted tell the federal government that they don't want to be a part of this. Are more states going to be doing this? Are we looking at a revolt here of the states against this?
Well, I think it really matters on how much federal money the state is getting, because that's really one of the sanctions. One of the sanctions is if you know you have too many schools in need of assistance, then we're going to take away your federal funding. So some states don't have that much federal funding, and so they can afford to say, no, we're not going to play this game your way, guys. You know, we're just not going to play. Go ahead and take away the funding. We can live without it. And I'm not sure that all states are in that position. I would probably say that most urban areas, most states that have large urban areas probably are not won't be able to do that.
I think there's probably two other issues here, Gary. I know for the Iowa City schools, it's only 4% of our budget. And so when you start to say the massive changes that are going to happen, is it worth the 4% of the budget? I think that's why some states are saying it. And then the second reason probably has more to do with the fact that in order to make some of the changes, the state's going to have to invest even more money than they're getting in for the No Child Left Behind Act dollars. The case that's probably the most significant is the cost of tests. If you were to purchase a test off the shelf, in other words, a vendor product published by a publisher, I don't think you can do it for less than $8 a student. And if you haven't been giving tests to children in 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 11th grade, which will be the requirement, you have a sizable expenditure that you're going to incur that you didn't have in the past. So that's why some of the states are saying, we're going to pass a law that says, well, we'll do this act, but we will not let any more of our state or local dollars go into it. So it's put districts and whole states in a very difficult position financially.
Is it true that I've heard that in some places they've had to lay off teachers or associates to hire people to manage the testing?
I think that could very well be true. Now, that's not the case in the Iowa City Community School District, as probably most of the state districts in the state of Iowa, and that is because even before this legislation, 99% of the districts gave the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. It was designed as a service to the children and the teachers and the parents of the state of Iowa. The only cost that districts incur is actually the cost of scoring. It's somewhere in the ballpark of $1.25 per child. So it is a relatively inexpensive test for us. That's unique in the United States of America. We are very, very fortunate to have that test. Now, I might add, though, initially when that was the proposal of the Iowa Department of Education to the U.S. Department of Education, it was turned down. We
When
were
was
told this past summer that test was not satisfactory. Well, that would have been a huge financial obligation for the school districts in the state of Iowa if they all had to start buying a publisher's test at full cost. Would have been very expensive.
Which does, you know, Gary, this is from an ostensibly conservative administration. This is the mother of all unfunded mandates. This thing is so expensive in its actual application. And I do think that that's another place that the congressional support really kind of got buffaloed with this. The reauthorization of all the education bills, all the bills that cover schools. Pam made it a point early on, but she made it quickly, and I'd like to go back to it. Generally speaking, if you're going to reauthorize every 7 years, you up the funding. Right. 7 years ago, it didn't cost as much to do it as it does now, and it'll cost more 7 years from now. And the funding stream simply did not follow. It didn't follow the regulations, and it didn't follow the application of the regulations, and that's been a huge problem.
But it's my understanding that we have more federal money in education than we had a couple years ago.
I think we shifted funds because there were some categories that used to be federal funding that dried up, and those funds then got shifted into ESEA and No Child Left Behind Act.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned some of these subgroups. Now, originally in this law, weren't they not testing people who couldn't even speak English?
That is accurate, because when all is all, that means all. So even children that came to our community school district that had just moved here from another continent, could have been that their parents were coming here to graduate school, or perhaps it was a visiting professor and they had no English. If they came to our school 2 days before the test was given and they spoke no English, they were expected to take the test because that was the rule.
Well, that's an absurdity, isn't it?
It certainly is. And I want the audience, please be assured that we were not cruel to any student and forced them to take a test in which they could not read. We complied with the law and they participated. but basically they were given the test, and if we asked them, did they understand, and they said no, we said that that was okay, they didn't need to complete the task. But those tests had to be scored, and their test scores went into our district's average.
So they were given a 0? Or-
They get scored, and they're probably at the first percentile rank.
So it's based on percentiles.
Correct.
So they're in the first percentile. And that brought down the total aggregate
Correct.
percentile for the whole district.
Now, Rod Page just last week, I believe it was,
And he's the Secretary of Education.
right, and I just happened to be in Washington, D.C. the day that he announced that, said that they were going to relax the rules just a little bit, and for those children who did not speak English as their first language, they would have a year to be able to acquire English, and they would be tested the second year.
Yeah, it's interesting because there was an article in the Times that said, rules on kids who can't speak English relaxed, and you had to go down to the bottom of the article to find out it was only a 1-year hiatus.
Right.
So, what are they thinking about?
I've oftentimes wondered that, Gary.
You've been to Washington, and
Well, and any good ESL teacher, English as a second language teacher, will tell you that certainly within a year they have acquired a great deal of vocabulary. But that doesn't mean that they're fluent in the language and would understand all of the idiosyncrasies that the English language has to the point that they could perform on a test as if it were in their first language.
now do our schools have to be at something like a 40 percentile? Is that correct?
It's the student that is to score at the 40th percentile, which brings up a whole nother interesting issue. The test is actually designed on a bell-shaped curve, and as any good mathematics teacher, Barb could probably tell you, how probable is it that 100% of all children can be at the 40th percentile or higher?
It's completely improbable. It's mathematically impossible.
So that's 100% of them have to be at the 40th percentile.
Well, the whole definition of percentile means the number of students that fall below out of 100. So the 40th percentile means that there are 40 students below that one student. So you have to have some students below the 40th percentile. That's just the way. That's the definition of it.
They're
yeah.
mine, they're not proficient, and they're bringing the school into need of assistance. And that's the problem.
And that
your
doesn't-
students
Yeah.
in special ed.
And that doesn't mean that the children don't do well on the test, because a percentile and a percentage aren't the same.
Right.
It doesn't mean that they're missing 40% of the questions. It just means that if you had 100 kids stacked in a row and you lined up their test scores, this is the distribution and how it fell.
And I think this gets at the innumeracy of our society a little bit, because if you have a student who even on a standardized test gets in the 16th percentile one year, and then the next year is still in the 16th percentile, that student has basically made a year's worth of growth right along with all the other 100 people that they were grouped with. Because they've stayed in the same place, they're in the same position. It's not like the rest of the kids grew and this one didn't. They grew also. They're just kind of at the same place. And so there are a lot of people that don't understand that. They think, well, the next year they should be higher than 16. But that's not true. That's still a year's worth of growth. And it's just a lot of misunderstanding about test scoring and percentiles, and it's very confusing to most people.
And not all kids, it simply is not the case that all kids are capable of making a year's growth, what that definition is in a year's time. But to use this, and we have always given the ITBS, Metropolitan in Chicago when I grew up, that's not the question. The question is the application of the test. What are we using them for? Who are we using them on? And that's so good for Pam to reassure people, but in fact, this has put a level of anxiety on kids and teachers and families that is completely out of proportion to what those tests were designed to do. If we had the test designers sitting here for the ITBS, who are all still thankfully alive and kicking up the road, they would tell you this was never designed. These were simply not designed to do what they're being asked to do.
For example, special ed.
That kind of testing.
And kids who don't.
We have all
know
kinds of
English.
assessment measures for students with specific and challenging learning problems. All kinds of them. That's a whole cottage industry in and of itself. but we can't use them for this because they're not the standardized test used for all kids. Well, of course they're not.
And is there one standardized test that's used? You said the ITBS, but is that's not the test that's used here by the U.S. Department of Education?
Every state can select which test they want to use, which is also another interesting twist, that the different states use different tests and they can have different criteria.
Wait a second. Different states can use different tests.
Correct. And they can set up what is the definition of proficient. They have to have it approved by the U.S. Department of Education. But what I was using is not the same as what Nebraska is using, and it's not the same as what Texas is using, and it's not the same as what Florida is using. So we have different tests all over the U.S. And even if they use the same test, they could set up different proficiency levels.
Well, that's quite confusing, I must say.
It's quite confusing because, for example, in Texas, we've got a staff member from Southeast who is now teaching down there. And by anecdote, the kids apparently in Texas do better than the kids in Iowa, one of the most historically well-educated states in the country. And they do that because they've set their standards differently. They got approval on their test. And what they do with the vast majority of the thing I know about kids who receive special education supports is now their entire curriculum. They learn their reading by learning the test. They learn their math by learning the test. They do nothing except teach the test.
Teach the test.
So that those kids in those subgroups who will be at risk, who everyone knows will be at risk for making that number, whatever it is in Texas, and I don't remember, that's how they do it. It is the case that we can teach pretty much, I think we would all agree on this, we can all pretty much teach anything to any student we're given. It's a matter of adaptation, it's a matter of task accommodation. We can teach almost anything. The question is, with all the things there are to learn in the world, for kids with lots of learning challenges, is it really the case that that's where we want to focus our energies? And now we've resisted that. Iowa was one of the last, I think the last state to get its approval.
How much?
We resisted for so long.
Okay, I mean, we started the show by, Pam, you were saying this is simply a reauthorization of an ongoing education act. Every 7 years it has to be reauthorized. I still would like to know, with all of these incredible drawbacks to it, unfunded mandates, making kids take tests that aren't qualified to pass the tests, putting schools on watch lists that are actually very good schools. What can we do here? I mean, we've got about 5 minutes left in the show. What's going to have to be done to this act to make it workable?
Well, the rules and regulations clearly need to be changed, and I think every person needs to be writing their congressional representatives, email, phone calls, letters through the U.S. mail, saying that changes need to occur. I would strongly encourage that the Congress needs to have some guidance from not only educators, but probably from people like the designers of tests to say what is reasonable. If you want to hold schools accountable, and I certainly support that, what are appropriate ways to measure student learning, and how can you measure growth over time, as opposed to saying, I've set the bar, now start jumping towards it. So my strongest recommendation is we need to get to our congressional representatives and say, make a change in this, because it simply will not happen. Educators predicted this 2 years ago, and everybody said, oh, you're just crying wolf.
When did they predict that? When it was first, let's see, this is, so
in 2002.
Beginning of 2002, after it was just passed.
And normally, when this legislation is reauthorized, you have a full year to look and implement the rules and regulations. It went into effect the day that the pen went to the paper. And states have been scrambling ever since then just to try to make it happen.
Well, Barb, do you know if the NEA, that terrorist organization, I mean, what is their plan?
Well, and that's...
And what is the AFT plan, if you know that?
And I don't know that, but the NEA's plan is to ask for funding, definitely more funding for it, but also It just needs to be rewritten. And I think Pam had some really good ideas that you need to there needs to be some changes that will allow for individual differences. There should be something that makes it possible for good school districts to test the kids and have the information that we need to have in order to make some changes and provide for students to grow and to be learning to provide that accountability.
Well, Sue, you're a political person, obviously. How are we going to get our legislators, our senators, our congressmen to pay attention to what's in this bill as we try to rewrite it, when obviously they didn't pay attention 3 years ago? I mean, I think it's disgraceful that they passed this legislation without a clue of knowing what's in it.
Well, and remembering that the reminder at the head of the thing, we're not representing public access TV. The caveat I have to put in for Dr. Pluggy that I'm not representing the school district.
Right.
You change the administration. You get out there and
we're
you
talking
work.
about the national
Yes, I am.
administration.
You change the Bush administration. This is bad law. This is law that has an agenda. It has an agenda about public education, and I think you get in there and you change that. I think what you do now is there are lots of fires burning with this, and you do what you can to keep those going. You make sure that you hold people accountable. We're not the only ones who should be held accountable. The teachers in this country and the administrators in this country and the public schools in this country are not the only ones who should be held accountable.
So what do you think Bush's agenda was in here? We got about 2 minutes left.
I think President Bush represents an agenda that is not pro-public education. And this allows for and really almost forces the situation where people are going to, if Southeast Junior High and Northwest Junior High, if Decorah High School, if College Community can be listed as schools in need of assistance, then the entire public education system in this country is in need of assistance. I would submit that would be where we would agree.
So
I think it is in need of assistance.
Is he trying to get vouchers and charter
I think he is.
schools and the whole
I think he is.
agenda?
And of course, you'd have to have somebody representing that position on to speak well to it. But I think that he is, and I think that it's an agenda that damages public education. And from where I sit, that's an agenda that damages the country. I think a strong public education system is necessary for this democracy to work, and I think this goes right to the heart of it.
Well, absolutely. Pam, since you go to Washington and you speak to people, we've got about a minute left, are you hopeful at all that we're going to get this thing rewritten no matter who's elected in November?
I think so. I think simply by listening to the news of last week, when 80% of the state of Minnesota has schools that are on this watch list, as Sue said, along with Iowa and the other Midwestern states, it's hard to believe that those kinds of schools are failing schools. They aren't failing schools. And so that's such a clear recognition that there's a flaw in the law, that it will be changed.
Have you had any feedback from any of our legislators, whether it's Congressman Leach or our senators, whatever?
I have not.
And you have communicated with them, I take it?
Communicated not. My trip to Washington had to do with the Kennedy Center partnership with Hampshire, so don't think that was the reason that I was there. But the communication is flowing from all directions.
All right. Well, hopefully in this coming year, we're going to do something about this, because it's an absolute disgrace that we have schools in Iowa City that are called failing schools on some sort of watch list, and that there's some sort of agenda back there that parents don't even know about. So thank you very much for watching. This has been a discussion of No Child Left Behind with Pam Ehly, Director of Instruction at the Iowa City Public Schools, Barb Henke, math teacher at West and president of the Iowa City Education Association, and Sue Dvorsky, special education teacher at Southeast Junior High School. Thanks for being with us.